June 1997. In a wooded area of rural Oregon, investigators followed directions that led them off a logging road and into a stretch of land few people ever noticed. There, beneath loose soil and scattered debris, they uncovered a shallow grave, and inside it was the body of a 3-year-old girl. Her name was Tesslynn Elizabeth O'Cull. She had been gone for days, but no missing child alert had been issued. No hospital had reported an emergency, and no one had called to say she needed help. By the time she was found, the people who were supposed to protect her had already made their decisions and moved on as if nothing had happened. This case would later be described as the worst child case in Oregon's history, not because of what happened in secret, but because so much of it happened openly. Neighbors noticed, visitors noticed, and even police officers had been to the home weeks earlier and left without taking action. One phone call could have changed the outcome. One report could have interrupted what was happening. But that call never came. But to understand how Tesslynn Elizabeth O'Cull ended up buried off a logging road, investigators had to go back months earlier to a small apartment in Springfield, Oregon, and to the chain of choices that quietly sealed her fate. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Tesslynn was born on June 8, 1994, the second child of Stella Ann Kaiser and Jason Adam O'Cull. And from the beginning, she was described as small, bright, and gentle, the kind of toddler who noticed everything around her and wanted to be part of it. She spent her earliest years alongside her older brother, Jason Jr., and family members later said the two were inseparable in the way young siblings often are, following each other from room to room, sharing toys. She loved animals, especially dogs and horses, and whenever she encountered one, she would stop whatever she was doing just to watch, fascinated by movement and sound. She liked to draw, even when she was still too young to hold a pencil properly, and she was happiest during bath time, splashing with her toys and laughing at the water, moments that stood out because they were simple and joyful. Tesslynn's mom, Stella Ann Kaiser's life did not begin with violence or criminal attention, but it did begin with instability that followed her into adulthood and shaped many of the decisions she later made. She was born in September 1975 and grew up in California alongside her twin brother, Billy Kaiser, and several siblings. And for much of their childhood, the family appeared outwardly intact, even if emotionally strained behind closed doors. Billy later said that growing up, their father was strict and controlling, and while Stella would later claim that she experienced during her childhood, Billy did not describe their upbringing in the same way. He acknowledged that their father could be harsh and demanding, but he did not recall the kind of ongoing Stella later referenced in court, which became an important point of contrast during legal proceedings. What both siblings agreed on, however, was that the household was tense and that their father's presence carried emotional weight that affected everyone. That weight became permanent in August of 1989 when Stella was 13 years old and her father died by inside the family home. The sudden loss fractured what stability remained, and from that point forward, Stella struggled emotionally in ways that became more pronounced over time. Family members described a shift in her behavior, marked by detachment, impulsivity, and increasing difficulty coping with stress. As Stella moved into her teenage years, those struggles became more visible. She began using alcohol and drugs early, and by her own admission, substance use became a regular part of her life long before adulthood. School never provided structure or direction, and relationships often filled that void instead. She sought connection quickly and intensely, but those connections were rarely stable. In her mid-teens, Stella met Jason Adam O'Cull, and the relationship moved fast. They were both young, and neither had the resources or maturity to support a family, but they stayed together, and in their late teens, they welcomed their first child, a son named Jason Jr. Family members later said that Stella appeared overwhelmed almost immediately by the responsibilities of motherhood, relying heavily on others for housing, childcare, and financial support. When Tesslynn Elizabeth O'Cull was born on June 8, 1994, Stella was just 18 years old. On the surface, the arrival of a second child should have prompted stability, but instead it intensified the existing pattern. The family moved frequently, often staying with relatives or depending on Jason's parents for support, and long-term plans were rare. As the relationship between Stella and Jason O'Cull deteriorated, instability increased, arguments became more frequent, financial pressure was on the high. So, Stella made the decision to leave California for Oregon, framing the move as a chance to start over. But by the end of 1996, she paid a visit back to California around Christmas. Stella arrived with both of her children, Jason Jr. and Tesslynn, and for the first time in months, family members were able to observe her parenting up close rather than through phone calls and brief updates. What they saw immediately raised concern. Stella appeared short-tempered and easily frustrated with Jason Jr., who was then around 5 or 6 years old. They noticed harsh discipline, sudden anger, and moments where Stella seemed overwhelmed by his behavior, reacting in ways that felt alarming. Jason Jr. was described as anxious and unsettled during the visit, and relatives said his behavior suggested a child under significant stress. Those concerns escalated quickly. Stella reportedly admitted to family members that she had reached the end of her patience with her son and that she felt unable to cope with him any longer. So, when the visit ended and Stella prepared to return to Oregon, her family insisted that Jason Jr. stay behind in California. They believed it was necessary to protect him, and they believed at the time that Tesslynn was not at risk. Family members later said that Stella had never shown the same anger or aggression toward her younger daughter, who was still a toddler and largely dependent, quieter and easier to manage. So Jason Jr. stayed with his father and paternal relatives, and Tesslynn went back to Oregon with her mother. That separation mattered. Experts and investigators later pointed out that this pattern aligned with what is known as targeted CA, a phenomenon in which is directed at one child within a household, while another child remains largely unharmed. It is not uncommon for the child perceived as more demanding, defiant, or disruptive to become the focus of frustration, while a quieter or younger sibling is spared, at least temporarily. But when the original target is removed, the risk does not disappear. Instead, the focus often shifts. At the time, however, no one believed that Tesslynn would become that new focus. So, Stella returned to Oregon alone with her daughter, presenting the move as a fresh start, but the isolation created by that decision, combined with Stella's unresolved instability and ongoing substance use, created conditions that would soon prove dangerous. Because within weeks of returning to Oregon, Stella met someone who already had a documented history with child protection authorities. By the time Jesse Caleb Compton entered Tesslynn's life, there was already a documented trail behind him, and it was one that should have raised alarms long before he ever shared a roof with a young child. Jesse was 20 years old in 1997, and although he was still young, his history with authorities was already established, particularly in matters involving instability, aggression, and child welfare concerns. Records later showed that Jesse was a father himself, and that relationship had already brought him to the attention of Oregon's State Office for Services to Children and Families, commonly referred to as SCF. Months before he met Stella, reports had been made alleging CA involving his own young daughter, and police had been called repeatedly to the apartment he shared with the child's mother. Those calls were not isolated incidents. They were frequent enough that child protection workers became involved, and eventually a restraining order was put in place to keep Jesse away from his daughter. For a time, authorities believed the situation had been resolved. Jesse's daughter was removed from the apartment, and she was only returned after officials were satisfied that Jesse was no longer living there and had no contact with her. On paper, the problem appeared contained. In reality, it was only displaced. The underlying behavior had not changed, but oversight relaxed, and Jesse was once again free to move on without restrictions that followed him closely enough. It was during this period that Jesse crossed paths with Stella Ann Kaiser. Stella was attending court-ordered parenting classes in Springfield, Oregon, and it was through that environment that the two met. The irony is hard to ignore in hindsight. A man with an existing history involving child protection concerns met a struggling young mother inside a system designed to improve parenting, not expose children to further risk. But the connection moved quickly. Within weeks, Stella and Jesse began a relationship, and shortly after that, Stella moved herself and Tesslynn into Jesse's apartment at 1490 North 5th Street in Springfield. It was a small unit in a modest complex, but neighbors later described it as chaotic, volatile, and often loud. People came and went at all hours, and arguments were not unusual. Still, no formal barriers existed to stop a toddler from being placed there. What no one outside that apartment fully understood at the time was how much Jesse's past mattered in that moment, and how closely his prior behavior mirrored what would later be described by witnesses. And once Stella and Tesslynn moved into the apartment on North 5th Street, the atmosphere inside changed almost immediately, and people who were present during that period later described it as tense, unstable, and unpredictable. The apartment became a regular gathering place for adults who came to drink, use substances, and stay for long stretches of time, sometimes without leaving for days. The use of meth was openly discussed by witnesses, and several described Jesse as someone who used it frequently and visibly, while Stella participated and rarely intervened in what was happening around her. But that's not all. Jesse asserted control, both over the space and over Tesslynn, and Stella allowed that control to continue. Witnesses later said Jesse took it upon himself to handle discipline, and Stella deferred to him, even when his behavior made others uncomfortable. And when people questioned what they were seeing, Stella did not argue or defend Tesslynn. Instead, she often brushed off concerns or told others to let Jesse handle it. Neighbors later told investigators that they frequently heard loud arguments coming from the apartment, followed by sounds that suggested a child in distress. Some neighbors said they heard crying that went on for long periods of time, and others described hearing shouting followed by sudden silence, which they found unsettling but did not know how to interpret at the moment. Visitors who were inside the apartment during gatherings provided even more direct accounts. Several recalled seeing Jesse speak harshly to Tesslynn, calling her names and isolating her from the rest of the room. They described situations where she was made to stand alone for extended periods while adults continued their activities nearby. There were also moments when Jesse became visibly angry, and the room would go quiet because people were afraid of provoking him. At least one person recalled Jesse making threats toward anyone who talked about contacting authorities, saying there would be consequences if anyone interfered. Over time, Tesslynn's presence in shared spaces became less frequent. She was increasingly kept inside the bedroom, and access to her was restricted. Jesse controlled who could go near that room, and people who asked about Tesslynn were told she was sleeping or being punished. When she did come out, she was often fully covered, regardless of the weather, and rarely interacted freely with anyone other than Stella or Jesse. The isolation was gradual, but it was noticeable. People who had once seen Tesslynn moving around the apartment or outside the unit said that eventually they stopped seeing her altogether, but no one challenged that boundary forcefully enough to stop what was happening. And by the end of May 1997, concern about Tesslynn had reached someone who could no longer ignore it. An acquaintance who had been inside the apartment contacted Billy Kaiser, Stella's twin brother, and told him plainly that something was wrong, that Tesslynn was being harmed, and that he needed to act. Billy did not dismiss the warning or assume it was exaggerated. He took it seriously, and he moved quickly. Billy gathered a few friends and went straight to the apartment complex in Springfield. When they arrived, what they saw immediately alarmed them. The front door to the apartment had been nailed shut from the inside, an act that made no sense for normal safety and raised obvious questions. Billy tried to speak with Jesse, but Jesse refused to open the door or let anyone inside, and the situation escalated so fast that police were called. And when officers arrived, they spoke with Billy outside, and then they spoke with Jesse and Stella without entering the apartment. Jesse told officers he had nailed the door shut because he was afraid of Billy, and that explanation, though unusual, was accepted without further challenge. Stella assured the officers that everything inside the home was fine and that Tesslynn was not hurt. But one neighbor stepped forward during the visit and urged police to go inside and check on the child, telling them directly that something was wrong. However, the officers did not enter the apartment. Instead, one officer went behind the building, broke a few boards on the fence, and shined a flashlight through a rear window. From that vantage point, he saw Tesslynn sitting on or near a couch partially covered by a blanket. Then the officer waved and Tesslynn waved back. That brief interaction became the deciding moment, and based on that single visual confirmation, officers concluded that Tesslynn appeared fine, and the welfare check ended there. No one went inside the apartment to see the conditions she was living in or the injuries that would later be documented. Really, that's heartbreaking. Most critically, no report was made to the state office for services to children and families, despite Oregon law requiring law enforcement to notify child protection authorities when allegations of CA were raised. And no cross-check of Jesse's prior history with child protection services, which would have revealed earlier accusations involving his own child. The entire visit lasted less than half an hour. Billy was told he was escalating the situation and was asked to leave, and the officers drove away, believing they had resolved the concern. And just 2 weeks later, Tesslynn would be gone. As June began, Tesslynn turned 3 years old. June 8, 1997 came and went without any sign of a celebration, without visitors, and without the small markers people normally associate with a child reaching that age. During that final stretch, signs of physical distress became increasingly difficult to ignore. Tesslynn was heard crying for extended periods, then growing quiet, then crying again, and witnesses later described those sounds as different from before, slower and weaker, as if something was clearly wrong. Despite those warning signs, no one sought medical care for her, even though help was nearby and accessible. On her last day, Tesslynn remained confined, and she was not seen outside the apartment. At some point, it became clear to the adults present that she was in serious trouble, and that her condition had worsened beyond what they could ignore. And when they realized Tesslynn was no longer responsive, they didn't call for help. Instead of calling for help, Stella Kaiser and Jesse Compton talked privately about what to do next. Then Jesse contacted his younger sister, Lacey Compton, who was 18 at the time, and asked her to come over. When she arrived, she was told that Tesslynn needed to be taken somewhere, and Tesslynn's body was placed inside a laundry basket, and the basket was loaded into a vehicle under the cover of night. Lacey drove, following Jesse's directions, and they traveled away from Springfield toward a remote area near Sweet Home, Oregon. Eventually, they turned onto a logging road that led into a wooded stretch far from homes or regular traffic. There, Tesslynn was buried in a shallow grave, marked only by disturbed soil and debris that blended into the surrounding ground. When the burial was finished, they left the area without alerting anyone and returned to their lives as if nothing had changed. Back at the apartment, Stella and Jesse focused on removing anything that could connect them to Tesslynn's presence. Items associated with her were gathered up and discarded, and the apartment was cleaned just enough to erase obvious traces. In the days that followed, people who saw them noticed a change in their behavior, but not the kind that raised immediate suspicion. Instead of arguing, they appeared calm and unusually affectionate. They talked openly about leaving town, starting over, and even having another child together in the future. When asked about Tesslynn, sometimes they said she was with a babysitter. Other times they claimed she was visiting a relative, but secrets of that magnitude rarely hold, and one person involved could not live with what they knew. So, on June 16, 1997, just days after the burial, Lacey Compton contacted the Springfield Police Department. She told officers she had information about a missing child, and she explained that she had helped transport Tesslynn's body to a remote area near Sweet Home, Oregon. She gave specific directions, including the type of road, the distance traveled, and where the grave was located. Investigators acted immediately. Within hours, officers followed Lacey's directions down a logging road and into a wooded area that matched her description. There, they located a shallow grave. Tesslynn Elizabeth O'Cull was recovered the next day. Alongside her body, investigators found items that confirmed the burial had been deliberate and recent, including cloth materials, a belt, and personal objects that did not belong in that location. Those items would later become critical in linking the scene back to the apartment in Springfield. After the recovery, police secured Jesse Compton's apartment and executed a search warrant. Inside, they found evidence that directly contradicted the explanations Jesse and Stella had been giving. Investigators recovered cut cords, knotted fabric, discarded materials matching items found at the burial site, and household objects that indicated prolonged confinement and restraint. Trash bags thrown into the apartment complex dumpster were also retrieved, and items inside them were forensically linked to the scene and to Tesslynn. As the evidence came together, investigators began to understand that this was not a sudden incident or an accident, but a sustained pattern. That conclusion was reinforced by the autopsy findings, which were extensive but carefully documented. the medical examiner determined that Tesslynn had suffered repeated physical harm over a period of time, not just in the days before her death. Injuries were found at different stages of healing, showing that the harm had been ongoing and escalating. The autopsy also documented severe burns all over her body, including her private part and tissue damage consistent with direct contact from a high-heat source. Investigators later linked those injuries to a propane torch recovered from the apartment, an object Jesse was known to use. Toxicology testing revealed the presence of substances in Tesslynn's system that were not ingested intentionally, but absorbed through damaged skin, further confirming prolonged exposure to unsafe conditions. Internal injuries showed signs of blunt force trauma, and medical experts testified that Tesslynn had been in extreme medical distress prior to her death, including SA. That was really unimaginable for a 3-year-old child, especially when you know your mom is aware of everything. The official cause of death was ruled as battered child syndrome, a medical determination used when a child's death results from repeated and intentional physical harm rather than a single incident. In Tesslynn's case, the examiner stated that shock, internal injuries, and complications from sustained trauma all contributed to her death. It was not one injury that ended her life, but the cumulative effect of what she had been subjected to. With those findings, arrests followed quickly. On June 17, 1997, both Jesse Caleb Compton and Stella Ann Kaiser were taken into custody. Prosecutors later made it clear that while Jesse was believed to have inflicted most of the physical harm, Stella was charged because she knew what was happening, failed to intervene, and actively participated in concealing the crime. From that point forward, the case moved from investigation to prosecution, and the full scope of what had happened inside that apartment began to come into public view. Jesse Caleb Compton was tried first, and prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, and related offenses tied to long-term CA and fatal physical harm. From the start, the state framed its case around a clear narrative. This was not a single moment of loss of control, but a sustained pattern of deliberate actions that unfolded over weeks. The prosecution relied heavily on medical testimony, forensic timelines, and Jesse's own behavior before and after Tesslynn's death. They introduced evidence recovered from the apartment, describing how the injuries developed over time rather than all at once. But the defense attempted to undermine the state's timeline and argued that responsibility was being unfairly concentrated on one person in a chaotic household affected by substance use. They questioned witness credibility and suggested that others shared responsibility, but they did not dispute that Tesslynn had suffered extensive harm. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Jesse Compton was convicted on all major counts, and the court imposed a death sentence, citing the severity of the conduct, the age of the victim, and the prolonged nature of the. Under Oregon law at the time, the sentence triggered an automatic appeal. But Stella Ann Kaiser's legal path was more complicated, and it unfolded in 2 separate trials. In her first trial, prosecutors charged her with aggravated murder, and of a corpse, arguing that she knowingly enabled what was happening and took active steps to conceal it. They pointed to her own statements to police, witness testimony showing she was present in the apartment during the period, and evidence that she chose not to seek medical care even though emergency services were located directly across the street. The defense took a different approach. Stella's attorneys focused on her personal history, substance use, and claimed mental health conditions, including PTSD and personality disorders. Expert witnesses testified that these factors impaired her judgment and made her dependent on Jesse, arguing that she lacked the capacity to act independently or intervene effectively. They also claimed she was unaware of the full extent of the harm until it was too late. The jury deliberated for days, but they could not reach a unanimous decision. One juror remained unconvinced of guilt under the aggravated murder standard, and the judge declared a mistrial. Just weeks later, Stella faced a second trial, and this time, the presentation was more direct. Prosecutors emphasized Stella's own words during police interviews, including statements that showed she feared discovery more than she sought help. They challenged the defense experts by pointing out inconsistencies between Stella's courtroom narrative and what she had told investigators immediately after her arrest. Jurors also heard testimony about her actions after Tesslynn's death, including conversations about leaving town and warnings given to others not to talk. The state argued that these choices demonstrated awareness, intent, and participation rather than helplessness. This time, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Stella Ann Kaiser was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But in 2011, Oregon's then governor announced a statewide moratorium on executions. And when Kate Brown later assumed office, that policy did not end. Instead, it became formalized and extended. Under her administration, the state continued to uphold death sentences on paper, but it stopped carrying them out in practice. Her administration made it clear that Oregon would not move forward with executions. That decision placed Jesse Compton into a legal limbo shared by other death row inmates across the state. He remained incarcerated under a death sentence, but without an execution date. Then in 2020, Governor Brown took another step that directly affected Jesse's status. Oregon officially closed its death row unit, citing safety concerns, costs, and the long-term effects of isolation. Inmates previously housed on death row were transferred to other facilities within the state prison system, including Jesse Compton, who was moved to Two Rivers Correctional Institution. And for many observers, that reality changed everything because even when the legal system reaches a verdict, the meaning of justice can continue to shift long after the courtroom doors close. But before all this, law enforcement agencies in Lane County reviewed how child welfare calls were handled, especially situations involving welfare checks and restricted access to a child. One of the most significant changes came in how officers interpreted their authority during community caretaking calls, and police were formally permitted to enter a residence without a warrant when there were reasonable concerns about a child's safety. This shift directly addressed what had happened on May 30, 1997, when officers stood outside a sealed door and relied on a brief visual check instead of confirming a child's condition in person. Child protection agencies also revisited how reports were documented and escalated, particularly in cases involving prior SCF contact and adults with known histories. While no single law was officially named after Tesslynn, her case became a reference point in training discussions, internal reviews, and policy reform conversations throughout the region. These changes came too late for one child, but they were meant to reduce the chance of another missed intervention ending the same way. But for Tesslynn's family, there was no resolution that brought relief. Her older brother, Jason Jr., grew up without his sister and without his mother, and relatives later acknowledged that the loss reshaped his childhood in ways that were never fully repaired. In December 2007, Tesslynn's paternal grandfather, Ken O'Cull, passed away and was buried near her grave. Relatives said he never stopped thinking about her, and that the weight of losing her stayed with him until the end of his life. Over time, Tesslynn's name became part of broader community efforts focused on child protection awareness. Each year, local advocates organize the Walk a Mile for a Child, a public event dedicated to honoring children lost and raising funds for prevention and education. But Tesslynn's case did not exist in isolation. Across Oregon, reports of suspected CA and neglect numbered in the tens of thousands each year, with thousands of those cases substantiated after investigation. In one recent reporting period, Oregon received nearly 95,000 reports of suspected or neglect, and more than 8,000 were confirmed after assessment by the state's Child Welfare Agency. In that same period, 16 Oregon children died as a result of or neglect. Statewide child welfare data also shows that while investigations are conducted for many thousands of children, a small but persistent number of child fatalities per year are linked to maltreatment, often involving children under 6 years old, the same age range that included Tesslynn. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.